Sometimes the cruelest jokes reveal the deepest truths about who we really are. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks becomes the one who changes everything. In the village of Brynhov, the townsfolk thought they were being clever when they sent Solveig to clean the war heroes' hall. She was the woman they whispered about, heavy-set, plain, with a sharp tongue that cut too deep. They wanted to humiliate her in front of Eirik Thorvaldsson, the giant warrior who had just returned from distant battles. But when Solveig arrived with her broom, something unexpected happened. The massive warrior didn't laugh. He didn't mock. He simply watched. Day after day, as she cleaned his empty hall, he began to talk. Not about glory or conquest, but about loneliness. About how a warrior's greatest enemy isn't on any battlefield. It's the silence that fills an empty home. Soon he asked her to stay, not as a joke, but because he had found something the village never saw in her. But what happens when those who meant to shame her discover they've awakened a bond that will shake their world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried more than snow through the village of Brynhov that winter morning. It carried whispers, sharp as blade edges, cutting through the spaces between wooden homes where smoke rose thin and desperate against the grey sky. Each gust seemed to gather the voices of women huddled over their morning fires, their words mixing with the scent of pine and the distant salt of the fjord. "Did you see her at market yesterday?" Astrid's voice drifted from her doorway, where she stood shaking out a wool blanket. "Solveig, I mean. Walking like she owns the place." "Owns it?" Helga laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "With what?" "That woman hasn't owned anything proper since her husband died. Just that sad little cottage and her sharp tongue." The wind carried their laughter too, swirling it past the smaller homes toward the edge of the village where Solveig's cottage sat like a question mark against the tree line. Inside, she moved, with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to find purpose in simple tasks. Her hands, thick and capable, worked dough that would become the day's bread. The same hands that had tended her husband Olaf through his final illness, that had buried him when the ground thawed, that had kept working when the village women turned their backs. She was not beautiful by their standards, never had been. At 53, her body carried the weight of years and sorrows, her face marked by lines that spoke of laughter and tears in equal measure. Her grey-streaked hair hung in a simple braid down her back, practical rather than pretty. But her eyes held something that made the village women uncomfortable. Intelligence, dignity, the kind of quiet strength that couldn't be broken by whispers or stolen by time. Mother used to say she was pretty once, young Bjorn had mentioned to his friends just last week, earning harsh looks from the older women. Before the sadness settled in her face, the sadness, that's what they called it when they wanted to sound kind, as if Solveig's grief over losing Olaf was something that had simply arrived one day like an unwelcome guest, rather than a companion. She had chosen to walk with rather than abandon her memories. But grief, Solveig had learned, was not the enemy people believed it to be. It was a teacher, stern but honest. It had taught her that she could survive alone, that she could face each morning without Olaf's gentle snoring beside her, could eat supper across from an empty chair, could find reasons to smile even when the village treated her like a shadow of a woman rather than a woman herself. The cottage still held traces of Olaf everywhere. His axe by the door, though she split her own kindling now. His favourite cup, though she drank her morning ale from a smaller one. His side of the bed, though she slept in the middle now, arms spread wide, like she was embracing all the space he had left behind. This morning felt different, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the quality of light filtering through her small window, or the way the wind seemed to pause between gusts, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She had learned to pay attention to such moments. In her experience, they usually meant change was coming. The horn's sound, when it came, confirmed her instinct. Long and deep, it echoed across the village like the voice of an ancient god calling his children home. 3 short blasts followed, the signal that had made every heart in Brynhov race for the past 2 months. Eirik Thorvaldsson was returning. Solveig paused in her bread-making, flour dusting her fingers as she listened to the commotion beginning outside. Doors slammed open, voices called out in excitement, feet ran through snow toward the village center. Where the great longhouse stood, its carved dragon head seeming to writhe in the morning mist. Eirik Thorvaldsson. Even his name carried weight in Brynhov, spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for gods or legends. He was both, in many ways, a giant of a man who stood head and shoulders above other warriors, whose reputation for fierce loyalty and devastating strength had spread far beyond their small village. For 3 years, he had been away fighting for King Harald, leading raids that had brought glory and gold back to their people. The war horn that announced his return sat in his longhouse even now, carved from the horn of an auroch he had killed with his bare hands as a young man. It was a symbol of everything he represented: primal strength, ancient tradition, the kind of masculinity that made other men step aside and women lower their eyes in respect or desire. But Solveig remembered a different Eirik. She remembered the boy who had sat quietly in the back of the village gatherings, listening more than speaking. The young man who had helped her carry water buckets when Olaf's back was too sore to work. The warrior who had knelt beside Olaf's grave after the funeral, not saying a word, just placing a smooth stone on the mound before walking away. She had wondered in the years since if that gentleness had survived the battles. Or changed men, everyone knew that. Some came back harder, colder, with eyes that looked through you rather than at you. Others returned with their spirits cracked like pottery, unable to find their place in the peaceful rhythms of village life. Which would Eirik be? The question followed her as she finished her bread and began tidying her cottage. Outside, the sounds of celebration grew louder. She could hear Magnus the blacksmith calling out orders, probably organizing some kind of welcome ceremony. She could hear children laughing and running, their voices bright with excitement at the prospect of seeing the legendary warrior. She did not go to watch his arrival. Let the others crowd around him like moths around flame. Solveig had learned the value of observing from a distance, of letting others reveal themselves through their actions rather than their words. If Eirik had truly changed, she would know soon enough. If he hadn't, well, that would be even more interesting. The afternoon brought visitors to her door, though not the kind she might have hoped for. Astrid and Helga arrived together, their faces wearing the particular expression that meant they had been planning something and needed Solveig's participation. "We've been talking," Astrid began without preamble, brushing snow from her cloak as she stepped uninvited into the cottage. "About the welcome celebration for Eirik." "Of course you have." Solveig continued kneading her evening bread, not bothering to look up. "And what grand plans have you made?" Helga moved closer to the fire, rubbing her hands together. "Well, we thought, that is, the village council thought, that someone should prepare his longhouse for his return. Clean it properly, you understand. Make it worthy of a hero." Something in their tone made Solveig's hands still in the dough. She looked up slowly, meeting their eyes. And we thought of you," Astrid said, her voice taking on a false sweetness that made Solveig's stomach tighten. "You're so good at that sort of thing. Cleaning, organizing, making things proper." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying meanings that none of them would speak aloud. Solveig was good at cleaning because she was alone, because she had nothing better to do with her time. She would be appropriate for the task because she was safely past the age where an unmarried man might find her attractive, because her presence would cause no complications or gossip, because it would be amusing to see the village's most mocked woman presented to its greatest hero as his temporary servant. Solveig looked from one woman to the other, reading the anticipation in their faces, the barely contained excitement of people who believed they had crafted the perfect jest. They wanted to see her humiliated, wanted to watch Eirik's reaction. When confronted with their offering of the woman no one wanted, she could refuse, should refuse, let them find another target for their cruelty. but something in her rebelled against the expected response. Perhaps it was curiosity about what Eirik had become. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, the desire to face their mockery with dignity rather than flee from it. Perhaps it was the memory of that young man placing a stone on Olaf's grave, the gentleness in his massive hands. "When?" she asked simply. Astrid blinked, clearly having expected more resistance. "Tomorrow morning, early. We want everything ready before the evening feast." "And what exactly are you expecting me to do?" "Clean the great hall," Helga said quickly. "Sweep the floors, tend the fires, prepare food, make it feel like a home rather than an empty shell." Solveig nodded slowly, already seeing how this would unfold. They would present her arrival as an honor, the village's gift to their returning hero. They would watch for his reaction, hoping for embarrassment or disgust. They would feast on whatever discomfort they could create. "Very well," she said, turning back to her bread. "I'll be there at dawn." The two women exchanged glances, perhaps surprised by her easy acceptance. They had expected pleading or anger, not this calm agreement. It took some of the pleasure out of their scheme. After they left, Solveig continued. Her work in silence, but her mind was turning over possibilities like stones in a riverbed. Tomorrow would bring confrontation of one kind or another. Either Eirik would prove himself as cruel as the women hoped, or he would surprise them all. As evening settled over Brynhov, she found herself looking forward to discovering which man would be waiting in that longhouse. The legend or the human being, the god of war or the boy who had shown kindness to a grieving widow. She suspected the truth would be more complex than either. That night, she dreamed of war horns and weathered brooms, of laughter that cut like knives and silence that healed like balm. She dreamed of a great hall empty except for shadows, and footsteps that echoed not with loneliness but with possibility. When she woke, snow was falling again, covering the village in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. It seemed like a good omen for whatever was coming. Dawn came grey and cold, the kind of morning that made breath visible and fingers ache with the promise of winter's deeper bite. Solveig wrapped her heaviest cloak around her shoulders and picked up the broom she had prepared the night before. Old but sturdy, its handle worn smooth by years of honest work. The weathered wood felt familiar in her hands, a comfort against the uncertainty ahead. The village was stirring as she made her way toward the center, smoke rising from chimneys like prayers ascending to indifferent gods. A few early risers paused to watch her pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed anticipation. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in Brynhov. By evening, everyone would know how the morning had unfolded. Magnus the blacksmith stepped out of his workshop as she approached, his massive frame blocking her path. His face wore the particular smile that meant he was enjoying himself at someone else's expense. "Solveig," he called out, loud enough for others to hear. "The village council has chosen you for a great honor, so I've been told." She kept walking, forcing him to step aside or be rude enough to physically block her way. "You'll represent all of Brynhov in welcoming our hero home," he continued, falling into step beside her. "It's quite a responsibility. I'm sure I'll manage." More villagers had emerged now, forming a loose procession behind them. Children ran ahead, excited by the prospect of witnessing whatever entertainment the adults had planned. Women whispered among themselves, their voices carrying the particular tone that meant gossip was being freshly minted with each word. Astrid appeared at Solveig's other side, her face bright with false encouragement. "We've prepared a special introduction for you. Magnus will present you to Eirik as our chosen representative, the woman we've selected to tend his hall and ensure his comfort." The words were carefully chosen to sound respectful, while carrying their true meaning like poison in honey. Solveig heard what they really meant. Watch the great warrior's face when he sees what joke the village has played on him. The longhouse loomed ahead, its peaked roof and carved dragon heads magnificent against the pale sky. It was the largest building in Brynhov, capable of housing 50 warriors during times of celebration or crisis. Now it stood empty, except for whatever ghosts of memory Eirik might bring with him. The great oak doors, carved with intricate knotwork that told the story of the village's founding, stood slightly ajar. Smoke drifted from the central chimney, suggesting someone had already lit the fires within. Solveig paused at the threshold, her hand tightening on the broom handle. This was her last chance to turn back, to preserve her dignity by refusing to play their game. Instead, she pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The great hall stretched before her, vast and shadowy, despite the flickering light from the central fire pit. Wooden beams arched overhead like the ribs of some massive beast, and tapestries hung from the walls, depicting scenes of battle and triumph. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, sat 2 chairs carved from single pieces of oak, the high seats where the lord of the hall would hold court, and there, in the shadows beside those chairs, stood Eirik Thorvaldsson. He was larger than she remembered, broader across the shoulders and chest, his presence filling the space around him like a physical force. His hair had grown longer during his years away, falling in thick waves past his shoulders, streaked now with early silver that caught the firelight. His beard, once neatly trimmed, now fell to his chest in the wild fashion of warriors who had spent years far from civilization. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Dark blue like deep water, they watched her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of every step she took across the rush-covered floor. There was no mockery in that gaze, no amusement at her expense. Instead, she saw something that surprised her, a kind of weary recognition. As if he understood exactly what was happening and why she was here, the villagers had followed her inside, clustering near the entrance like spectators at a wrestling match. Magnus cleared his throat importantly, preparing to deliver his speech. Eirik Thorvaldsson, hero of Brynhov, we present to you the woman our council has chosen to honor your return. Solveig Olafsdottir will tend your hall and see to your comfort, as befits a warrior of your great renown. The words echoed in the vast space, formal and hollow. Solveig kept her eyes on Eirik's face, watching for the moment when understanding would dawn, and she would see either cruelty or pity replace the current stillness of his expression. Instead, he stepped forward into the light, and she saw something that made her breath catch. His left arm hung differently than his right, the shoulder set at an angle that spoke of old injury, poorly healed. When he moved, she caught the slightest hitch in his gait, so subtle that only someone watching carefully would notice. The great warrior had returned wounded. I see, Eirik said, his voice deeper than she remembered, roughened by years of shouting orders over the clash of battle. And what does Solveig Olafsdottir think of this honor? The question was directed at her, not Magnus or the council. For the first time since entering the hall, she allowed herself to look directly into his eyes. What she saw there was not the cold distance she had feared, but something almost like relief, I think, she said carefully. That a hall is only as strong as those who tend it. A small smile touched the corners of his mouth. Wise words, and do you think this hall needs tending? She looked around deliberately, taking in the dust motes dancing in the firelight, the cold ashes in smaller hearths along the walls, the emptiness that spoke of a space waiting for purpose. Every hall needs tending, my lord. The question is whether it has someone willing to do the work, and are you willing? The question hung between them, heavy with meanings that had nothing to do with sweeping floors or cooking meals. Behind her, she could hear the restless shuffling of the villagers, their anticipation building toward whatever climax they expected. Solveig lifted her broom slightly, her gesture both practical and somehow ceremonial. I brought my tools. Eirik nodded slowly, as if she had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. Then perhaps we should let them serve their purpose. Magnus thanked the council for their thoughtfulness. Tell them I'm pleased with their choice. Magnus blinked, clearly confused by this response. You are, indeed. Solveig Olafsdottir is exactly what this hall needs. Eirik's gaze never left her face. But I suspect the work will take some time. Days, perhaps weeks. I hope she's prepared for such a commitment. Weeks. Astrid's voice carried a note of alarm. This was not how their jest was supposed to unfold. A proper cleaning cannot be rushed, Eirik replied mildly. And I've grown accustomed to having things done properly. He turned to Solveig. If that suits you, of course. She felt the weight of the moment, understanding that her answer would set something in motion that none of them could predict. The villagers had expected humiliation and laughter. Instead, they were witnessing something else entirely. A recognition between two people who had both learned that appearances could deceive and that strength often wore unexpected faces. It suits me well, my lord. Good. Eirik moved to a wooden chest near the high seats and withdrew an iron key, its metal black with age. Then this is yours while you work. He held out the key, and she stepped forward to take it. Their fingers brushed as it passed from his hand to hers, and she felt the calluses earned through years of gripping sword and axe. The careful steadiness of hands that had learned both violence and control. The key was warm from his touch and heavier than she had expected. It represented more than simple access to the longhouse. It was trust made tangible, responsibility given form. As her fingers closed around it, she understood that whatever game the villagers had started was now beyond their control. I'll return at first light tomorrow, she said. I'll be here. The simple words carried a promise that made her pulse quicken. As she turned to leave, she caught glimpses of the villagers' faces, confusion, disappointment, and a growing awareness that their carefully planned humiliation had somehow transformed into something else entirely. Behind her, Eirik's voice followed her to the door. Solveig? She paused and looked back. Thank you. The gratitude in his voice was real, unfeigned. It stayed with her as she walked through the snow toward her cottage, the iron key heavy in her pocket and the weathered broom still in her hand. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new possibilities, new challenges to navigate. But tonight, for the first time in years, she fell asleep with anticipation rather than resignation in her heart. The key turned in the lock with a sound like distant thunder, deep and resonant in the morning stillness. Solveig pushed open the great doors and stepped into the longhouse alone, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving only glowing embers that cast shifting shadows across the carved beams overhead. Eirik was nowhere to be seen, though she could hear movement from the private chambers at the far end of the hall. She set down her basket of supplies, rags and soap, dried herbs for freshening rushes, a small pot of honey for polishing wood, and began to assess the work ahead. The hall was not dirty in the way of a place long abandoned, but it held the particular emptiness of a space that had been maintained without being truly lived in. You're early, his voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him emerging from the shadows near the private quarters. He moved with the careful gait she had noticed yesterday, favoring his left side in a way that suggested old pain rather than fresh injury. I rise with the sun, she replied, beginning to remove items from her basket. It's a habit that serves me well. He approached slowly, and in the morning light filtering through the high windows, she could see him more clearly than she had the day before. The years of war had marked him in ways beyond the obvious injury. There were scars on his hands and forearms, pale lines that spoke of blade work and close combat. His face, while still handsome in the strong-featured way of northern men, carried a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. Tell me, he said, settling into one of the high chairs with careful movements, what the village really expected when they sent you here. The directness of the question caught her off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Warriors, she supposed, learned to value honesty over politeness. She paused in her unpacking, considering how much truth to offer. They expected entertainment, she said finally, the kind that comes from watching someone be humiliated. And you came anyway. I came anyway. He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those deep blue eyes. Why? It was a fair question, one she had asked herself during the sleepless hours of the previous night. Why had she agreed to be the target of their cruel jest? Why had she walked into this hall knowing what waited for her? Because, she said, straightening to meet his gaze, sometimes the only way to defeat a joke is to refuse to be its punchline. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition, perhaps of a fellow soul who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of others' expectations. And how does one do that? By being exactly who you are, without apology or pretense. She lifted her broom, its worn handle familiar in her hands. They sent me here to clean your hall, thinking you would find me lacking. Instead, I intend to clean it so well that you'll wonder how you ever lived without proper tending. The laugh that escaped him was rusty, as if he hadn't used it in some time. Ambitious, practical, she began sweeping, starting near the great doors and working her way inward. A clean hall serves its purpose better than a dirty one. Food tastes better when prepared in a proper kitchen. Fires burn warmer when the hearths are well maintained. These are not grand gestures, they're simply what needs doing. As she worked, she became aware that he was watching her with the kind of attention most people reserved for unfamiliar animals or strange weather patterns. Not mockery or judgment, but genuine curiosity, as if her methodical approach to sweeping rushes was something worthy of study. "You have children?" he asked after a while. "No." The word came out more sharply than she intended. "Olaf and I were not blessed in that way. I'm sorry, don't be. We had other blessings." She paused in her sweeping, allowing herself to remember. "Olaf used to say that some people are meant to tend their own garden, while others are meant to help tend the world. We helped where we could. And now? Now I tend what's in front of me." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, broken only by the whisper of her broom against stone and rushes. She found herself falling into the rhythm of the work, the familiar motions that allowed her mind to wander while her hands stayed busy. This was meditation of a sort, the kind of prayer that required no words. When she reached the area near his chair, she gestured for him to move. "If you please, my lord." He rose carefully, and she saw him wince slightly as weight settled on his left leg. Without thinking, she asked, "How long since the injury?" His stillness told her she had overstepped, but after a moment he answered, 2 winters past. A Saxon axe that found its mark despite my shield. Does it pain you still?" "Some days more than others." He moved to lean against a wooden pillar, watching as she swept beneath where his chair had been. "The healers said I was fortunate to keep the leg. Healers see what is, not what could be." She straightened, meeting his eyes. "My husband lived 3 years with a bad back that the healers said would cripple him within months. Some pains teach us to move differently, not to stop moving." Wise words from a woman who tends halls, wise words from a woman who has lived. She resumed her sweeping, moving toward the central fire pit. Experience is a harsh teacher, but thorough. As the morning wore on, she became aware of other things about the hall that spoke of its master's character. The weapons displayed on the walls were well maintained, but not ostentatious. The few personal items visible, a carved wooden cup, a cloak folded carefully over a chest, a small wooden figure of a horse, suggested a man who valued quality over quantity, but there were also absences that spoke volumes. No feminine touches anywhere. No signs that the hall had ever been a place of family gatherings or celebrations. It felt like a fortress that had never learned to be a home. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" she asked suddenly, the question emerging from her observations about the cold cooking hearth and the absence of any food preparation. He seemed surprised by the question. "I ate yesterday." "What did you eat?" "Bread, some dried meat. That's not a meal. That's survival." She gestured toward the cooking area. "A man who has fought for his people deserves better than scraps eaten in solitude. I'm not accustomed to—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "It's been some time since anyone concerned themselves with such things." The admission carried more weight than perhaps he intended. She heard in it not just the practical realities of a warrior's life, but something deeper, a profound loneliness that had learned to disguise itself as self-sufficiency. "Well," she said, setting aside her broom and moving toward her basket, "that changes today. I brought ingredients for proper stew and bread that's worth eating. Consider it part of the hall's proper tending." As she began to build up the cooking fire, she felt his attention on her, like a physical presence. There was something in that attention. Not desire exactly, but a kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. The hunger of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. To have another person notice their needs and move to meet them without being asked. It was a hunger she recognized, because she had felt it herself in the long months after Olaf's death. The stew's aroma filled the great hall like an embrace, rich with herbs and the promise of warmth. Solveig stirred the pot with steady motions, tasting and adjusting as Olaf had taught her years ago. Behind her, she could hear Eirik moving restlessly, his footsteps marking irregular patterns across the stone floor. "You don't have to watch me cook," she said without turning around. "I'm quite capable of managing both pot and fire. I'm not watching you cook." His voice came from closer than she expected. "I'm trying to remember the last time this hall smelled like a home." The admission hung between them, heavy with unintended revelation. Solveig continued stirring, allowing the silence to stretch without rushing to fill it. Some truths needed space to breathe before they could be properly acknowledged. "Tell me about the battles," she said finally. "Not the glory parts, the real parts." He was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice had taken on a different quality, distant and careful. Cold. Mostly I remember the cold. Even in summer, mail chills you to the bone when the sun goes down. And the waiting, people think battle is all clash and fury, but mostly it's waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for weather, waiting for the enemy to make their move. She added more herbs to the pot, letting their fragrance rise with the steam. "And the coming home. What was that like?" "Strange." The word came out like a confession. 3 years gone, and everything looks smaller than you remembered. People you thought you knew have become strangers. Children have grown past recognition. The places that lived in your memory don't match what you find when you return, including this hall. Especially this hall. She heard him settle into one of the chairs, the wood creaking under his weight. "My father built this place to be the heart of the village. When I was young, it was always full. Feasts, councils, celebrations. Now it feels like a tomb built for someone who isn't dead yet." Solveig ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls, the thick broth steaming in the cool air. She carried them to where he sat, placing one before him and settling into the chair beside him with her own. It felt presumptuous to take the high seat uninvited, but he gestured for her to sit, as if her presence there was the most natural thing in the world. The stew was good, rich and warming, with the kind of depth that came from proper seasoning and patient cooking. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes before Eirik spoke again. "The village expects me to take a wife." The statement was delivered matter-of-factly, but Solveig heard the tension underneath. "And what do you expect?" "I expect complications." He set down his spoon and looked at her directly. "A warrior with land and reputation draws attention from fathers with daughters to marry off. They see an opportunity for alliance, for securing their family's future. They don't see a man who wakes most nights from dreams that aren't dreams, battle memories." Among other things, he resumed eating, his movements deliberate and controlled. "It's not fair to ask someone to share a life that still belongs partially to the past." Solveig considered this while savoring her stew. It was an honest admission, the kind that revealed both self-awareness and genuine concern for others. Perhaps the right person wouldn't see it as sharing a life with the past, but helping to build a future that acknowledges where you've been. Is that what marriage should be? Marriage should be whatever serves the people within it. She broke off a piece of bread, using it to gather the last of her stew. Some marriages are alliances, some are conveniences, some are great passions. The best ones, I think, are partnerships between people who see each other clearly and choose to walk the same path anyway. You had that with your husband. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "We did. It took time to build, but yes. Olaf saw me, not the woman others expected me to be, but who I actually was. And I saw him the same way. The village doesn't see you clearly. The village sees what it chooses to see. That's their limitation, not mine." She finished her stew and set the bowl aside. "People often mistake loudness for strength, beauty for worth, conformity for virtue. They create stories about each other that are easier to understand than the complex truth. And what story have they created about me? She studied his face, noting the careful neutrality of his expression. This was a man who had learned to guard himself against others' perceptions while still being wounded by them. "They've made you into a legend," she said. "The great warrior who brings glory to Brynhov. The hero who validates their sense of importance. The prize to be won by the most suitable bride." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But legends aren't people. They're stories we tell ourselves to feel larger than we are. And what do you see? A man who carries his responsibilities like stones in a pack, who understands the weight of others' expectations and the cost of living up to them, who has learned that strength and loneliness often travel together." She met his eyes steadily. Someone who cleaned his wounds himself because he didn't want to burden others with his pain. The accuracy of her observation seemed to surprise him. How did you? The way you move. The care you take not to let the injury show. The absence of anyone here to tend things properly." She gestured around the hall. "A man with people who truly cared for his well-being wouldn't be eating dried meat alone in a cold hall." They sat in silence again. But it felt different now, charged with recognition and the beginnings of understanding. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. The sound only emphasized the warmth and shelter they had created within the hall. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" Eirik asked suddenly. The question surprised her with its directness. "Should I be?" "Most people are. Not obviously, but they watch me differently than they watch others. They're careful about what they say, how they move. They treat me like a weapon that might go off unexpectedly." Solveig considered this, thinking about the villagers' behavior the day before, the way they had clustered near the entrance, rather than approaching him directly. "I've known too much real fear to waste it on imagined dangers," she said finally. "You're a large man with a warrior's reputation, yes. But you're also someone who thanked me for sweeping your floor and who notices when others are in pain. Actions tell me more about a person than stories do, and my actions tell you I'm safe. Your actions tell me you're human." Something in his expression shifted at that, a softening around the eyes, a release of tension she hadn't even realized he was carrying. For just a moment, she glimpsed the man he might have been in a different life, one where war hadn't carved lines of caution into his face, and solitude hadn't become his most faithful companion. 3 days had passed since their first shared meal, and the rhythm between them had settled into something neither had expected, a comfortable partnership that felt both natural and revolutionary. Each morning Solveig arrived at dawn with the iron key that had become as familiar in her hand as her own heartbeat. Each evening they shared supper by the fire while shadows gathered in the corners of the great hall. The village had begun to take notice. "It's not proper," Helga whispered to Astrid as they watched Solveig walk toward the longhouse with her basket of supplies. "A woman spending so much time alone with a man. People will talk. People are already talking," Astrid replied, her voice sharp with frustration. Their carefully planned humiliation had transformed into something they couldn't control or understand. "Magnus says she's there from sunrise to sunset. What could possibly take so long to clean?" What took so long, Solveig could have told them, was that she had discovered something unexpected in Eirik Thorvaldsson, a mind that matched her own for depth and complexity. Their conversations had evolved from simple exchanges about domestic tasks to discussions that ranged across philosophy, memory, and the intricate challenge of finding purpose in a world that insisted on defining you by others' expectations. This morning, she found him in the small alcove behind the high seats, carefully tending to a collection of items she hadn't noticed before. Various weapons lay on a wooden table, not the display pieces that hung on the walls, but working tools that bore the marks of recent use and meticulous care. "Maintenance?" she asked, setting down her basket and approaching to observe his work. "Meditation," he corrected, looking up from the sword blade he was sharpening. The rhythms helped settle my mind. She watched as he drew the whetstone along the steel in smooth practice strokes. His movements held the same careful precision she brought to her own tasks, the kind of attention that transformed necessary work into something approaching art. "May I?" She gestured toward a smaller blade that lay nearby, its edge dulled from use. He paused in his work, studying her face. "You know how to tend weapons?" "Olaf taught me." He said a wise woman understands the tools that protect her home, even if she never has to use them. She picked up the blade and examined it in the morning light. "This one has seen hard use recently. Bandits on the road from the coast. 3 nights ago." His voice carried no boastfulness, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting completed tasks. "They thought a lone traveler would be easy prey." "Were you hurt?" "Scratched." "Nothing worth mentioning?" He resumed his sharpening, the sound of stone against steel creating a steady rhythm. "But it reminded me why I keep these in good condition." Solveig selected an appropriate stone and began working on the smaller blade. The motions came back to her easily, muscle memory preserved from years of helping Olaf maintain his tools. They worked in companionable silence, the shared task creating an intimacy that had nothing to do with words. "Tell me about the bandits," she said after a while. "Young, desperate, the kind that hunger makes foolish." He tested his blade's edge against a piece of leather, nodding satisfaction at the result. "I gave them food and sent them toward the southern settlements where they might find honest work." The admission surprised her. "You didn't kill them?" "No." He began cleaning the weapon with an oiled cloth, his movements gentle despite the strength in his hands. "There's a difference between killing to protect and killing to prove a point. These boys needed guidance, not graves. The village would expect you to bring back their heads as trophies. The village expects many things." His smile held no humor. "I've learned to disappoint them regularly." As she worked on the smaller blade, Solveig found herself thinking about the complexity of the man beside her. The villagers saw only the legend, the fierce warrior who brought glory and security to their settlement. They couldn't reconcile that image with someone who showed mercy to desperate bandits, or who found solace in the quiet rhythms of weapon maintenance. "Eirik," she said carefully, "what do you want from life now that the fighting is done?" He paused in his cleaning, the question clearly catching him off guard. "I'm not sure the fighting is ever truly done. I don't mean the wars and raids. I mean the daily battles, the ones we fight with ourselves, with others' expectations, with the gap between who we are and who we're supposed to be." For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, as if he were sharing a secret that even he wasn't sure he believed. "Peace," he said simply. "Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose that doesn't require proving anything to anyone. A reason to wake each morning that has nothing to do with glory or reputation or living up to stories others tell about me. And have you found any of that here?" He looked at her directly, his blue eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. "Some, more in the past few days than in years before." The admission hung between them like morning mist, visible but fragile, easily dispersed by too much attention or the wrong word. Solveig continued working on the blade, allowing the moment to settle without rushing to define or explore it. "The village council wants to meet with you," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Magnus mentioned it yesterday when I passed the smithy." "About what?" "Your future plans. Whether you intend to stay in Brynhov permanently. What role you'll take in governing. Whom you might marry." She tested the blade's edge against her thumb, careful not to break the skin. "The usual concerns of people who want to organize other people's lives." "And what did you tell Magnus?" "That I clean holes, not arrange lives." She set down the finished blade and selected another from the collection. "Though I suspect they're hoping I'll provide information about your intentions." "What makes you think that?" "Astrid asked me yesterday whether you'd mentioned any particular young women favorably. Helga wanted to know if you seemed lonely or restless." Solveig began working on the new blade, her strokes measured and sure. "They're trying to determine how best to approach you about marriage prospects." "Ah." His expression darkened slightly. The parade of suitable daughters begins. Is the prospect so terrible? The prospect of marriage? No, the prospect of marriage as a political arrangement designed to serve others' interests rather than create genuine partnership? He set aside his finished weapon and picked up another. That holds considerably less appeal. You could always refuse. I could. But a man in my position doesn't make decisions in isolation. What I choose affects the village's alliances, trade relationships, future security. He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. Sometimes I wonder if the freedom to choose your own path is a luxury that comes with anonymity. Solveig understood that burden better than he might expect. Even as a widow with few resources, she felt the pressure of others' expectations to remarry for security, to maintain certain standards of behavior, to fulfill the role the village had assigned her rather than forge her own way forward. Perhaps, she said thoughtfully, the trick is learning to choose your path while making it look like you're meeting their expectations. His hand stilled on the whetstone. Explain. Give them what they think they want in a way that serves what you actually need. She held up the blade she was working on, checking its edge in the light. Like hiring a woman to clean your hall who happens to provide companionship and honest conversation. Along with the housekeeping, the smile that crossed his face was the first truly relaxed expression she had seen from him. Clever woman, practical woman, she corrected. There's a difference. The storm that swept down from the northern mountains arrived without warning, bringing with it the kind of wind that could strip thatch from roofs and the promise of snow that would linger until spring. Solveig found herself trapped in the longhouse as afternoon darkened to early evening. The weather too fierce for the walk back to her cottage. You'll stay here tonight, Eirik said, banking the fires against the cold that seeped through even the thick stone walls. I won't have you risking the path in this weather. She looked toward the shuttered windows, where wind rattled the wooden boards with increasing violence. The village will notice if I don't return. Let them notice. He moved to a large wooden chest near the private chambers and withdrew a thick woolen blanket. Your safety matters more than their gossip. The blanket he offered was finely woven, dyed a deep blue that spoke of quality and care. As she took it, her fingers brushed against embroidered edges, intricate knotwork that had been stitched with obvious skill and attention. This is beautiful work, she said, examining the pattern more closely. Your mother's? My sister's. His voice carried an odd note, something between pride and sadness. Astrid was the finest needlewoman in 3 villages. She made that the winter before she married and moved south. Solveig wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, feeling the warmth and weight of it like an embrace. You miss her. Every day. He settled into his chair by the fire, his injured legs stretched out before him. She was the only person who could make me laugh when I was being too serious, or calm me down when anger got the better of my judgment. Letters aren't the same as having someone who knows you well enough to speak truth without fear. When did you last see her? 2 years passed, when I stopped at her husband's steading on my way to the wars. She was heavy with her 3rd child then, happy in a way that made her glow like firelight. He stared into the flames, lost in memory. She said I looked hollow, like I was carrying too much weight in places no one could see. She was right, she usually was. He glanced at Solveig, noting how the blanket's rich color complemented her skin. She would have liked you. Astrid had no patience for people who spoke in circles or pretended to be something they weren't. She valued honesty above politeness. A wise woman, the wisest I knew. When I was young and full of fury at the world's unfairness, she taught me that anger without purpose was just noise. When I wanted to prove myself through increasingly dangerous feats, she reminded me that true strength meant knowing when not to fight. The wind howled around the longhouse like a living thing seeking entry, but inside the hall felt secure and warm. Solveig found herself thinking about the conversation they'd had about marriage, about the pressure he faced to choose a suitable wife who would serve political purposes rather than personal happiness. Tell me about the women the village has in mind for you, she said carefully. His expression grew guarded. Why? Because understanding what they offer might help you determine what you actually want. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, settling more comfortably in her chair. Sometimes we learn what we value by examining what we don't. He was quiet for a moment, considering her words. There's Ingrid, Thornton's daughter. Beautiful, skilled at running a household, comes with a substantial dowry and connections to 3 neighboring settlements. But when I speak with her, I feel like I'm talking to someone who's performing a role rather than revealing herself. Everything she says seems calculated to present the most attractive version of who she thinks I want her to be. And the others? Ragnhild from the Eastern Farms, clever, well-spoken, shares my interest in the old stories and songs. He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly as his injured leg found a new position. She would make a fine companion for discussions of history and legend. I hear reservation in your voice. She sees the legend rather than the man. When she looks at me, her eyes hold the same expression I see in the young warriors who want to hear tales of glorious battles. She's in love with stories about Eirik Thorvaldsson, not interested in the reality of living with him. Solveig nodded understanding. She had seen that look herself, the way people sometimes focused on the dramatic aspects of others' lives while ignoring the daily complexities that actually defined them. And the third? Sigrid, the merchant's daughter. Practical, hardworking, would bring valuable trade connections. He rubbed his beard thoughtfully. She would be a good partner for building the kind of prosperity the village wants to see, but you don't love any of them. The statement wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. I don't even know any of them. Not really. These aren't courtships. They're negotiations, where I'm expected to choose the option that best serves everyone's interests, except my own. What would serve your interests? The question seemed to surprise him with its directness. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. Someone who sees me clearly, both the strength and the weakness, the legend and the man, and chooses to build something real anyway. Someone whose presence makes the hall feel like home, rather than a museum of past glories. He looked at her directly. Someone who brings peace instead of adding to the performance I already have to maintain. The intensity of his gaze made her aware of how intimate their situation had become. Alone together in the firelight, sharing honest thoughts while the storm raged outside. It was the kind of scenario that would fuel village gossip for months if anyone discovered it. You're describing partnership, she said carefully. Not just marriage, but genuine alliance between equals. Is that too much to ask? Not too much to ask. Perhaps too much to expect from arrangements made for political convenience. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. But not impossible to find, if you're willing to look beyond the obvious candidates. You think there are women in Brynhov who might offer what I'm seeking? I think, she said slowly, that sometimes what we're looking for is closer than we realize. Sometimes it's already there, disguised as something else entirely. He studied her face in the firelight, and she saw the moment when her meaning became clear to him. The air between them seemed to shift, charged with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Solveig, he said quietly. Yes, when this storm passes and the village sees that you spent the night here, they'll have things to say. They'll have things to say regardless. People create stories to fill the spaces where they lack information. She met his eyes steadily. The question is whether we'll let their stories define what we're building, or whether we'll write our own. Outside, the wind reached a crescendo that made the shutters groan against their hinges. But inside the hall, wrapped in his sister's blanket and warmed by firelight and honest conversation, Solveig felt safer than she had in years. The storm had given them a gift. Time outside the normal patterns, space to explore possibilities that daylight and routine might not allow. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight belonged to them alone. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cold, the world transformed by a blanket of snow that made everything look clean and new. Solveig woke in the guest alcove where Eirik had insisted she sleep, wrapped in Astrid's blanket and feeling more rested than she had in months. The great hall was quiet, except for the soft sounds of someone moving carefully near the main fire. She emerged to find Eirik preparing breakfast, his movements efficient despite the obvious stiffness in his injured leg. The domesticity of the scene struck her. This legendary warrior, stirring porridge and setting out bread like any village husband tending his family's needs. "You should have woken me," she said, approaching the fire. "You could have done many things," he interrupted gently. "But you were sleeping peacefully, and peace is too rare to disturb without cause." They ate together as morning light filtered through the shutters, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The conversation was comfortable, ranging from observations about the storm's damage to plans for the day's work. It felt, Solveig realized, like the kind of easy partnership she had shared with Olaf in their best years, the sense of two people moving through life in harmony rather than opposition. The knock on the great doors came just as they were finishing their meal. "Expecting visitors?" Solveig asked, noting how Eirik's expression immediately grew guarded. Never a good sign when people arrive unannounced. He rose carefully and moved toward the doors, his hand instinctively checking the position of his belt knife. "Stay back until we know what this is about." He opened the doors to reveal Magnus the blacksmith, accompanied by 3 other village elders, their faces wearing the particular expression that meant serious business. Behind them stood a young woman Solveig didn't immediately recognize, tall and fair-haired, dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of wealth and status. "Eirik Thorvaldsson," Magnus said formally. "We bring greetings from Jarl Thorstein of the Western Settlements. This is his daughter, Lady Ingrid, who has traveled far to make your acquaintance." The young woman stepped forward with practiced grace, her smile bright and clearly rehearsed. "Lord Eirik, my father sends his respects and hopes for friendship between our peoples. He has asked me to present you with tokens of his esteem from a leather satchel." She withdrew an object that made Solveig's breath catch, an arm ring of silver so pure it seemed to glow in the morning light, worked with intricate designs that spoke of master craftsmen and enormous wealth. The kind of gift that carried political weight, that created obligations and expectations with its very existence. "Your father is generous," Eirik said carefully, not reaching for the ring. "To what do I owe such honor?" Lady Ingrid's smile never wavered, but Solveig caught the flicker of calculation in her eyes. "My father has heard tales of your valor and wisdom. He believes an alliance between our houses would benefit both our peoples." "An alliance," Eirik repeated, his tone neutral. "A marriage alliance," Magnus clarified, his voice carrying obvious excitement. "Lady Ingrid comes with her. Father's blessing to explore the possibility of union between 2 of the North's most prominent families." The silver arm ring seemed to pulse with significance in the morning light. Solveig understood immediately what was happening. This was politics in action, the kind of high-stakes maneuvering that transformed personal choices into matters of regional importance. A connection to Jarl Thorstein would bring Brynhov prestige, trade opportunities, and military protection. It was exactly the kind of advantageous match the village council had been hoping for. "Perhaps," Lady Ingrid said smoothly, "we might speak privately about my father's proposal." Before Eirik could respond, Magnus gestured toward Solveig. Of course." Solveig was just finishing her cleaning duties for the morning. "She can return to her cottage while you discuss matters of importance." The dismissal was clear and deliberate, a reminder that some conversations were for nobility while others were for servants. Solveig felt the familiar sting of being relegated to the margins, but something in Eirik's expression stopped her from immediately complying. "Actually," he said quietly, "Solveig's work here is not yet complete. Lady Ingrid, perhaps you would be more comfortable in the village while I finish conducting my business. I'm sure Magnus can arrange suitable accommodations." The refusal was politely phrased but unmistakable. Lady Ingrid's smile faltered slightly, and Solveig saw her reassess the situation with the quick intelligence of someone trained in political maneuvering. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I wouldn't want to interrupt important work. Perhaps this evening would be more suitable for private conversation." Perhaps. Erik's tone gave nothing away. I'll send word when my schedule permits. After the visitors departed, promising to return later, the great hall felt charged with tension. Eirik stood staring at the closed doors, his jaw tight, with barely controlled frustration. That was a test, Solveig said quietly. Of what? Whether you would choose politics or principle. Whether you would dismiss me to accommodate their expectations. She moved closer, studying his face. Why didn't you? He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her pulse quicken. Because in one morning, you've shown me more genuine companionship than I've found in years of political courtship. Because when I imagine sharing this hall with someone, it's not with a woman who sees me as a means to advance her father's interests. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Solveig felt the weight of the moment, understanding that whatever happened next would change everything. Eirik, she said carefully, that silver arm ring represents opportunities that could transform Brynhov's future. Alliance with Jarl Thorsten could bring wealth and prestige, yes. It could also bind me to obligations I never chose, in service of goals that aren't my own. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes. Tell me honestly, do you think I should accept Lady Ingrid's proposal? The question was a trap and a gift in equal measure. The safe answer was yes. Of course he should consider such an advantageous match. The honest answer was far more complicated. I think, she said slowly, that you should choose the path that allows you to be who you truly are, rather than who others need you to be. And if being who I truly am means wanting something the village considers inappropriate, then you have a choice to make about whose approval matters more to you, theirs or your own. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against her cheek with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands so large and scarred. What if what I want is standing right in front of me, disguised as the village's cruel joke? The touch sent warmth spreading through her like wine, and she felt herself leaning into it, despite every rational thought telling her to step away. Then you'd be a fool to let others' expectations blind you to what's real, even if it means disappointing everyone who has plans for my future. Especially then. The kiss, when it came, was gentle and questioning, a request rather than a demand. Solveig felt herself responding before conscious thought could intervene, her hands finding their way to his chest as his arms encircled her waist. For a moment that felt like eternity, they stood together in the morning light, creating something new from the ashes of others' expectations. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, Eirik rested his forehead against hers. This changes everything, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed. It does. Outside, the village was waking to news that would spread like wildfire. Lady Ingrid's arrival, the silver arm ring, the prospect of a marriage alliance that would elevate Brynhov's status throughout the region. Soon everyone would be talking about Eirik's great fortune and speculating about wedding plans. But inside the great hall, wrapped in each other's arms, Solveig and Eirik were writing a different story entirely. One that began with a joke, meant to humiliate, and was transforming into something that neither of them had dared to hope for. The silver arm ring lay forgotten on the table, beautiful and cold in the morning light, while beside it sat Solveig's simple wooden bowls, humble, warm, and infinitely more precious for the intimacy they represented. The news of Lady Ingrid's arrival spread through Brynhov like fire through dry grass. By midday, every cottage buzzed with excitement about the potential marriage alliance, and by evening, the village council had called an emergency meeting to discuss the unprecedented opportunity that had fallen into their lap. Solveig made her way home through streets where conversations stopped when she appeared and resumed in urgent whispers after she passed. The weight of stairs followed her like a physical presence, and she understood that her position had become more precarious than ever. Before, she had been merely the object of the village's cruel humor. Now she was potentially the obstacle standing between Brynhov and its greatest chance for prosperity. She was kneading bread for the next day when Astrid and Helga appeared at her door. their faces wearing expressions of barely contained excitement mixed with something harder to define. "We need to talk," Astrid announced, pushing past Solveig into the cottage without invitation. "About your arrangement with Lord Eirik." "My arrangement?" "This cleaning business," Helga clarified, settling herself near the fire. "It served its purpose, don't you think?" "The hall is certainly clean enough now," Solveig continued working her dough, keeping her hands busy to hide their slight trembling. "Lord Eirik seems satisfied with the work." "I'm sure he is," Astrid said, her tone carrying implications that made Solveig's stomach tighten. "But circumstances have changed. Lady Ingrid's presence makes your continued attendance inappropriate." "Does it?" "A prospective bride shouldn't have to compete with a servant for her intended's attention," Helga said bluntly. "It's unseemly. It suggests Lord Eirik lacks proper judgment about maintaining boundaries." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Solveig set down her dough and faced the two women directly. "And what exactly are you suggesting I've done that's inappropriate?" "Spent too much time alone with him," Astrid replied immediately. "Created an intimacy that exceeds your station. Made yourself indispensable in ways that have nothing to do with housekeeping. I've cleaned his hall and prepared his meals." "Nothing more, haven't you?" Helga's eyes were sharp with suspicion. "Because Magnus saw you through the window yesterday evening, sitting by his fire like you belonged there. And this morning, Lady Ingrid mentioned that you were still present when she arrived to conduct private business." The trap was closing, Solveig realized. They had decided she was the problem that needed solving, and they were building a case for her removal that would serve their larger purposes. "What is it you want me to do?" "End the arrangement," Astrid said promptly. "Tell Lord Eirik that your work is complete and you won't be returning. Make it clear that you understand the impropriety of continuing. And if I refuse..." The two women exchanged glances that confirmed what Solveig had suspected. This wasn't a request. "The village council has concerns about your behavior," Helga said carefully. "About whether a widow living alone might be seeking inappropriate comfort from a man who should be focusing on suitable marriage prospects. Concerns that could affect your standing in the community," Astrid added. "Your ability to conduct business, maintain your cottage, receive support during difficult times." The threat was delicately phrased, but unmistakable. "Step aside willingly or be forced aside through social pressure and economic isolation." Solveig had seen it happen to other women who had crossed invisible lines or challenged unspoken rules. The village had ways of making life unbearable for those who refused to conform. "I see," she said quietly. "And what assurance do I have that ending the arrangement will satisfy these concerns?" "Your cooperation would demonstrate wisdom and proper understanding of your place," Astrid replied. "It would show that you recognize the importance of Lord Eirik's future happiness and Brynhov's prosperity." After they left, promising to return the next day for her decision, Solveig sat in her cottage and tried to think clearly through the fear and anger that clouded her judgment. She could comply with their demands, return to her previous life of quiet isolation, and watch from a distance as Eirik married Lady Ingrid for the good of the village. It would be the safe choice, the one that preserved her place in the community and avoided direct confrontation with forces stronger than herself. But it would also mean abandoning something precious that had grown between them, a connection that had transformed both their lives in ways neither had expected. It would mean accepting that her happiness was less important than political convenience, that her worth as a person was subordinate to others' plans for prosperity. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about choices, the ones that preserved safety and the ones that honored truth. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She arrived at the longhouse before dawn, using her key for what might be the last time. Eirik was already awake, standing by the central fire with a cup of ale in his hands and tension written in every line of his body. "They came to see you," he said without preamble. "Yes? What did they say?" She told him everything. The threats disguised as concerns, the pressure to end their arrangement, the choice between cooperation and social exile. As she spoke, she watched his expression grow darker, anger building behind his carefully controlled features. "And what did you tell them?" "That I would give them my answer today." She moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes. "But first, I need to know something. Yesterday when you kissed me, was that a moment of weakness or the beginning of something you're prepared to fight for?" The directness of her question seemed to surprise him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you're content to let political pressure separate us, then I should accept their terms and withdraw gracefully. But if you're willing to stand against the entire village for what we're building together, then I need to know that before I make my choice." He set down his cup and moved to stand directly before her, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "Solveig," he said quietly, "I've spent 3 years fighting other people's wars for causes I didn't choose. I've killed men whose only crime was standing between me and objectives that served kings I barely knew. I've sacrificed my youth, my health, and my peace of mind for glory that feels hollow and reputation that feels like a burden. And I'll be damned if I'll sacrifice the first real happiness I've found in years for the convenience of people who see me as a means to their own ends." His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, his touch warm against her skin. "If they want to make this a battle, then they'll discover that some things are worth fighting for." The conviction in his voice sent relief flooding through her like warm wine. "Even if it costs you Lady Ingrid's alliance? Even if it means disappointing everyone who has plans for your future? Especially then." He leaned down to rest his forehead against hers. "I've learned the difference between what people want from me and what I want from life. You've shown me that it's possible to find partnership without politics, companionship without calculation. Why would I trade that for a marriage that serves everyone's interests except my own? Because they'll make life difficult for both of us. The pressure, the gossip, the social isolation, let them try." His smile held no humor, but considerable determination. "I've faced Saxon shield walls and Danish berserkers. I think I can handle a village council armed with disapproval and wounded pride." She felt herself smiling, despite the seriousness of their situation. "You realize this means war. Good. I was getting tired of peace anyway." Outside, the village was stirring to life, unaware that the carefully laid plans for their hero's future were about to be swept aside by 2 people who had discovered that love, once acknowledged, was a force more powerful than political convenience. The iron key felt heavy in Solveig's pocket, not with the weight of metal, but with the significance of choice. Today, she would use it not just to enter the longhouse, but to lock the door against those who would separate them for the sake of others' ambitions. The battle for their future was about to begin, and they would face it together. The confrontation came at midday, when the sun was high enough to cast sharp shadows, and the entire village could witness what unfolded. Solveig had expected it. The delegation of council members, village elders, and concerned citizens who appeared at the longhouse doors like an army of disapproval marshalling for battle. Magnus led the group, his face grave with assumed authority. Beside him stood Astrid and Helga, their expressions radiating the particular satisfaction of people who believed justice was finally being served. Behind them clustered a dozen other villagers, including several young fathers whose daughters they hoped might catch Eirik's attention once the current obstacle was removed. But it was the figure at the back of the group that made Solveig's breath catch, Lady Ingrid herself. Her beautiful face arranged in an expression of wounded dignity that suggested she had been carefully coached in her role for this performance. "Lord Eirik," Magnus called out in a voice that carried across the village centre, "we come seeking resolution to a matter that concerns us all." Eirik emerged from the longhouse slowly, his massive frame filling the doorway as he surveyed the assembled crowd. He had dressed carefully for this moment, his finest tunic, his father's arm rings, the sword that marked his status as a warrior of renown. Every inch of him proclaimed authority and strength. making it clear that whatever came next would be on his terms. "Speak," he said simply. "The village council has grave concerns about the arrangement you've made with Solveig Olafsdottir," Magnus began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for important pronouncements. "An unmarried woman spending so much time alone with an unmarried man creates complications." "What complications?" "Questions about propriety, concerns about your judgment, uncertainty about your intentions regarding suitable marriage prospects." Magnus gestured toward Lady Ingrid, whose presence added weight to his words. "Lady Ingrid represents an opportunity for alliance that could transform Brynhov's future. Yet her position is undermined by the continued presence of a woman whose role in your household remains unclear." Eirik's gaze moved across the assembled faces, reading the mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and barely concealed excitement that marked people witnessing a drama that would be discussed for years to come. "I see," he said finally. "And what resolution does the council propose?" "That the cleaning arrangement be ended immediately," Astrid spoke up, emboldened by the crowd's support. "That Solveig return to her cottage and proper place in the community. That you give Lady Ingrid the consideration her station deserves." "The consideration her station deserves," Eirik repeated thoughtfully. "And what consideration does Solveig's service deserve? She has tended my hall faithfully, prepared meals that nourished both body and spirit, brought warmth to a place that was cold and empty." "She was paid for those services," Helga interjected, "in food, protection, and the honor of serving a war hero. Surely that's compensation enough, is it?" Eirik's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several villagers shift uncomfortably. "And what payment have I received for 3 years of fighting wars that protected your homes and families? What compensation for the scars I carry, the nightmares that wake me, the loneliness that has been my constant companion since returning?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, reminding everyone present that their comfortable lives had been purchased with his blood and sacrifice. Magnus cleared his throat nervously. "Your service to king and country brings honor." "Honor," Eirik cut him off, "is a cold bedfellow. Glory makes poor company during long winter nights. I've had my fill of both." Lady Ingrid stepped forward then, her voice carrying the trained sweetness of someone raised to speak at court. "Lord Eirik, surely you don't mean to suggest that duty and honor are worthless. My father has sent me here precisely because he recognizes your nobility and wishes to build alliance with a man of your caliber." "Your father," Eirik replied mildly, "has sent you here because alliance with me serves his political interests, just as this council wants to arrange my marriage because it serves their interests. But tell me, Lady Ingrid, what serves your interests? What do you want from a husband beyond the advancement of your family's position?" The question clearly flustered her. She had been prepared for courtly compliments and political discussions, not philosophical inquiries about personal desires. "I seek a partnership that honors both our houses." "That's what you've been taught to want," Eirik said gently. "But what do you actually want? When you imagine marriage, what do you hope to find?" The young woman's careful composure began to crack under the weight of honest questioning. I want to be valued, to be seen as more than just a means to alliance, to find someone who speaks to me as if my thoughts matter, not just my bloodline. And have you found that in our brief acquaintance?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Lady Ingrid looked down at her hands, understanding perhaps for the first time that she was as much a pawn in this game as anyone else. "I thought not," Eirik said kindly. "You deserve better than a marriage arranged for others' convenience. You deserve someone who sees you clearly and chooses you freely." He turned back to the assembled villagers, his voice growing stronger. "Just as I deserve the same choice." The moment stretched like a bowstring drawn to its limit, the entire village holding its breath as Eirik's words settled into understanding. Magnus stepped forward, his face flushed with the righteous anger of someone whose carefully laid plans were crumbling before his eyes. "You cannot be serious," he said, his voice rising. "You would throw away the greatest opportunity Brynhov has ever seen for the sake of a—" He caught himself before saying something that couldn't be taken back. But the unfinished insult hung in the air like poison. For the sake of what? Eirik's voice was deadly quiet. Choose your words carefully, Magnus. They will determine how this conversation proceeds. The blacksmith faltered under that cold stare, remembering suddenly that he was facing a man who had earned his reputation through violence as much as valor. For the sake of someone unsuitable, he finished weakly. Unsuitable. Eirik repeated the word, as if tasting something bitter. And what makes Solveig Olafsdottir unsuitable? Her wisdom? Her kindness? Her strength in the face of adversity? Her ability to see the man beneath the legend? She's not noble-born, Astrid interjected desperately. She brings no political advantage, no dowry, no connections that could benefit the village. She's just what? The voice came from behind Eirik as Solveig stepped out of the longhouse, having listened to enough from within. She moved to stand beside him, her chin raised in defiance of the stares and whispers that rippled through the crowd. Just a woman who knows the value of honest work? Just someone who tends what needs tending without expecting glory in return? Her appearance seemed to galvanize the opposition. Helga pointed an accusatory finger at her. You've bewitched him somehow. Made him forget his duty to his people. I've done nothing but be myself, Solveig replied calmly. If that's witchcraft, then perhaps the problem lies not with me, but with how rarely you've seen it practiced. Lady Ingerd, who had been standing quietly throughout the exchange, suddenly stepped forward. Lord Eirik, she said, her voice carrying a new note of steel, I release you from any obligation to consider my father's proposal. The crowd gasped. But she continued speaking, her words gaining strength as she found her courage. I came here thinking I wanted a husband who could elevate my status and secure my future. But listening to you speak to this woman, seeing how you look at her, I realize I want what you found. I want someone who sees me as more than a prize to be won, or a treaty to be signed. She turned to face the village council directly. My father will be disappointed, but he'll recover. There are other alliances to be made, other marriages to arrange. What Lord Eirik has found is far rarer and more valuable than political convenience. Magnus sputtered in disbelief. Lady Ingerd, surely you don't understand the implications. I understand perfectly. She cut him off with the authority that reminded everyone present of her noble birth. I understand that some of you would sacrifice his happiness for your own advancement. I understand that you see love as less important than gold or status. But I was raised to believe that true nobility comes from honorable action, not from forcing others to serve your interests. The tide of the confrontation was turning, but Magnus made one last desperate attempt to regain control. The village council has the authority to make decisions that serve the greater good, he declared. We can declare this arrangement inappropriate and demand— You can demand nothing. Eirik's voice cut through his words like a blade through cloth. I'm not your vassal to be commanded. I'm not your tool to be used for your benefit. I am a free man who has earned the right to choose his own path. He reached out and took Solveig's hand, their fingers interlacing with perfect naturalness. And I choose her, not because it serves anyone else's interests, but because she makes me remember what it feels like to be human, rather than legend. The simple gesture, 2 hands joined in public declaration, sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Some faces showed outrage, others resignation, and a few held the beginning of understanding. She came to my hall as a joke, Eirik continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the village center. You meant to humiliate her, to make sport of her pain. Instead, you gave me the greatest gift of my life, a woman who sees past the stories you tell about me to the man I actually am. Solveig squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his support. We ask nothing from you but the respect due to any free citizens of Brynhov, she said to the crowd. We'll build our life together without requiring your approval or assistance. All we ask is that you leave us in peace to tend our own happiness. The confrontation had reached its climax, and the outcome hung balanced on the edge of a knife. Some villagers were already turning away, accepting defeat, or simply losing interest in a drama that hadn't provided the entertainment they'd expected. Others remained, their faces hard with unresolved anger and thwarted ambition, but Eirik and Solveig stood together, hands clasped and hearts united, having declared their choice before gods and neighbors alike. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners in truth rather than convenience. 3 months later, the first signs of spring began to show themselves in the melting snow that revealed the earth beneath, in the longer days that promised warmth to come, and in the gradual thawing of attitudes that had frozen solid during the winter's confrontations. Solveig stood in the doorway of the longhouse, watching Eirik work in the small garden plot they had cleared together behind the great hall. His movements were careful but determined as he prepared the soil for planting, his injured leg no longer a source of shame, but simply another fact to be accommodated in the business of living. The sight of this legendary warrior tending vegetables with the same attention he had once given to weapons struck her as profoundly right. A man finding peace in creation rather than destruction. The village had taken time to adjust to their union. The wedding itself had been a quiet affair, witnessed by Lady Ingrid, who had remained an extra week to stand as sponsor. Young Bjorn, whose mother had finally admitted Solveig's right to happiness, and a handful of others who valued personal courage over social convention. No grand ceremony, no political celebration, just 2 people making promises to each other before the gods and those who truly wished them well. Magnus and his faction had maintained their disapproval for several weeks, making pointed comments about missed opportunities and the folly of choosing sentiment over strategy. But winter was hard, and Eirik's knowledge of hunting and his connections to other settlements proved valuable when food stores ran low and traders were needed to supplement dwindling supplies. Practical necessity had a way of softening ideological rigidity. The real change had come when raiders from the eastern shores had tested Brynhov's defenses in late winter. Eirik's response had been swift and decisive, not the berserker fury of legend, but the calculated competence of a mature warrior who understood that the best battles were the ones that ended quickly. His defense of the village had reminded everyone why they had been fortunate to have him. Regardless of whom he had chosen to marry, the turnips are looking promising, he called out, straightening to wipe sweat from his brow despite the cool air. Everything looks promising when you tend it properly, she replied, stepping out to join him in the garden. The question is whether you'll remember that when the harvest comes and you're tired of root vegetables with every meal. His laugh was easy now, no longer rusty from disuse. I seem to recall making similar promises about cleaning halls and cooking meals. How did that work out? Better than either of us expected. She knelt beside him, her hands joining his in the dark earth. Though I notice you've become suspiciously particular about how the rushes are laid and whether the fire is properly banked for the night, I've learned to appreciate good work when I see it. His hand found hers in the soil, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. Among other things, the sound of approaching footsteps made them look up to see Astrid walking toward them, her expression cautious but not hostile. The relationship between Solveig and the village women remained delicate, marked by careful politeness rather than warmth. But the sharp edge of antagonism had gradually worn away. "Solveig," she said formally, "I bring word from the council. Lady Ingrid has sent a message from her father's court." Solveig and Eirik exchanged glances, both wondering what news might come from that quarter. Ingrid had departed with grace and dignity, but her father's reaction to the failed alliance had been unknown. "What does she say?" Eirik asked, rising and helping Solveig to her feet. "That she has found a suitor who sees her clearly and chooses her freely. Your words, she says. A younger son with more honor than gold, who makes her laugh and values her thoughts above her bloodline." Astrid's expression softened slightly. "She sends her gratitude for the lesson and her hopes for your continued happiness." Relief and genuine pleasure crossed both their faces. Ingrid's happiness felt like vindication of the choice they had made, proof that following one's heart could lead to good outcomes for everyone involved. "There's more," Astrid continued. "Jarl Thorstein has proposed a different alliance, a trading partnership that would benefit both settlements without requiring marriage bonds. He was impressed, he says, by reports of your integrity and clear thinking, meaning the village gets its prosperity and connections without anyone having to sacrifice their personal happiness for politics. Astrid paused, seeming to wrestle with something before continuing. The council asked me to convey their acknowledgement that your choice may have served everyone's interests better than ours would have. It was as close to an apology as they were likely to receive, and Solveig found herself unexpectedly moved by the admission. Thank you for bringing the message. After Astrid left, they returned to their gardening in comfortable silence, hands working together in the earth that would feed them through the coming year. The simple domesticity of the moment struck Solveig as precious beyond measure. Two people who had found each other against all odds, building something real from the ashes of others' expectations. Do you ever regret it? Eirik asked quietly. Giving up your cottage, your independence, your peaceful solitude for this complicated life? She considered the question seriously, looking around at the longhouse that had become home, at the village that had finally accepted their right to happiness, at the man whose presence had transformed her understanding of what was possible. Never, she said firmly. I gave up survival for living. I traded solitude for partnership. I exchanged the safety of invisibility for the risk of being truly seen. She smiled, dirt on her hands and contentment in her heart. It was the best bargain I ever made. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they finished their work and walked together toward the longhouse. The great hall waited for them, warm with firelight and rich with the sense of home, a place that had learned to embrace love alongside legend, where two hearts had found shelter in each other's truth. The village's cruel joke had become their greatest blessing, proof that sometimes the most unexpected gifts come disguised as challenges, and that courage to follow one's heart can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. In choosing each other, they had chosen hope over fear, authenticity over appearance, and love over all the glittering substitutes the world offered in its place. And it was enough.